Aujourd'hui, nous avons une réunion informative.
Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Conformément à l'article 108.3G.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee is starting study of report number 1, Forest and Climate Change 2023, reports 1 to 5 from the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, referred to the committee on Thursday, April 20th, 2023.
Again, as you are all aware, the bells are going to ring at 5:15 for a 5:45 vote. As I've done in the past, I'm going to seek UC unanimous consent, so we will sit until 5:30 and then just go in and vote for 5:45. Doing so will give us actually more time with the witnesses. I only need a couple minutes for some business at the back end, and so if I do have UC, I'll move the committee business by about 10 minutes to 5:20, giving us more time with all our witnesses. And we, as you can see, we have a full house today. So do I have UC to run this meeting, unanimous consent from the members, to run this meeting until 5:30? Yes, Ms. Khalid.
If it's okay with you, can you revisit that question once the bells start ringing?
No, because as I said, that will preempt me. If I have it now, we will hear from the witnesses until 5:20, and if I don't have it, I'm going to proceed with committee business at 5:10. So I'm looking for UC. If you can deny it if you like, and I'll just proceed with committee business at 5:10.
Okay, in that case, I deny it, Chair.
Okay. Very good. This meeting, I think, is something we've been wanting to get to. So I want to thank all the witnesses to come in. From the Office of the Auditor General, we have Jerry DeMarco, Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Good to see you again. We have Marie-Pierre Grondin, Director, and Kimberly Leach, Principal. Thank you for coming in today. From the Department of the Environment, Jean-François Tremblay, Deputy Minister. Oh, I have my wrong glasses on. Bonjour. Yes, excuse me, pardon. Derek Hermanitz, Derek Hermanitz, Director General, Economic Analysis Directorate, and Lindsay Pratt, Director, Pollutant Inventories and Reporting. And then from the Department of Natural Resources, Monique Frisson, Director General, Trade, Economics and Industry Branch, Michael Vandergrift, Deputy Minister by video conference from Paris.
London, actually.
From London, pardon, de Londres. Bonjour. Glenn Hargrove, Assistant Deputy Minister, and Jeff Labonte, Associate Deputy Minister. I believe each of the three institutions have opening statements. We'll begin with Mr. DeMarco. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. We are delighted to appear before your committee to discuss our report on forestry and climate change that was tabled in the House of Commons on the 20th of April 2023. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Accompanying me today are Kimberly Leach and Marie-Pierre Grondin, responsible for the audit. Our audit focused on the design and implementation of the 2 Billion Trees program and how Canada tracks greenhouse gas emissions from forest. The federal government launched the 2 Billion Trees program to fight against climate change, enhance biodiversity, and support human well-being. Through the program, trees will be planted across Canada, including on Crown lands, Indigenous lands, in municipalities, and on private lands, such as farms. The majority of tree planting activities are cost-shared with partners. However, some groups, such as Indigenous partners, will also be supported with grants focused on capacity building, often with no cost-sharing requirement. Although Natural Resources Canada nearly met its objective to plant 30 million trees in 2021, it fell well short of its 2022 goal of 60 million trees. Delays in signing agreements with planting partners have not only significantly challenged the department's ability to plant the number of trees it had planned for 2022, but will also affect subsequent years, which have much more ambitious goals.
Period, we understand that some progress has been made in signing additional agreements. On the other hand, the department has announced that it is now counting trees planted under another department's program that has different objectives as part of the 2 billion trees program. If this program is no longer focused on planting 2 billion incremental trees, then the benefits of the program will be reduced. In addition, the program missed opportunities to enhance biodiversity and habitat-related benefits over the long term by not designing the program with specific funding considerations for habitat restoration for all funding streams. For example, in the 2021 planting season, Natural Resources Canada funded more than 270 monoculture sites, accounting for 14.4% of the total trees planted. Monoculture plantings do sequester carbon and may be appropriate in certain habitats. However, in the vast majority of circumstances, they do not support biodiversity and other benefits related to environmental and human well-being as much as more diverse plantings do. Beyond the 2 billion trees program, Natural Resources Canada, working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, did not provide a clear and complete picture of the role of Canada's forests in greenhouse gas emissions. For example, emission estimates varied significantly in reports over the years because of recalculations prompted by data updates. This changed whether forests were reported as a net source of emissions rather than capturing emissions. We found a lack of transparency about the effects of human activities and natural disturbances on forest emissions. Specifically, the department's reporting on how changes in forest management affected emissions was incomplete. Forest management activities such as clear-cutting, partial harvesting, slash burning, and creating reserves for biodiversity were not clearly or separately reported on. In addition, Canada's forests are becoming a net source of emissions because of forest fires and disturbances caused by insect outbreaks. A lack of transparency and accurate reporting makes it very difficult for decision makers to make informed decisions and for Canadians to hold government to account. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, and right on spot in terms of time, so appreciate that. Turning now to the Department of Natural Resources. Monique Fliesel, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, it's Michael Vandergrift here. I think I will make the opening statement if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
That certainly is. Over to you, please. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the committee for this invitation. I'll also like to thank the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development for this audit on forest and climate change.
Important, and as shown in our response and our action plan, the recommendations will help us to implement the program. We also appreciate the conversations we've had with the Commissioner on this subject. Les forêts et l'autre solution fondée sur la nature.
Forest and other nature-based solutions are an integral part of the fight against climate change. Trees generate many long-term benefits, revitalizing fire-ravaged areas, creating green jobs, and enhancing the well-being of Canadians for generations. Planting 2 billion trees is a long, complex, and ambitious program. As we move forward, we keep our foundational principle top of mind to plant the right trees in the right place for the right reasons. We have made significant progress in implementing this program. We have signed agreements or are in the process of negotiating to plant over 393 million trees. We have allocated funding for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, as well as distinction organizations and governments, taking into account the different needs and priorities of each distinction.
Planting that will support increased quality of life for Canadians in small and large cities. These advancements are in line with commitments made in our action plan and in response to the recommendations in the audit. We have also, for example, developed an operational plan and have provided guidance for applicants on single species planting to respond to the recommendations. Having jurisdiction over 90% of Canada's forests, provinces and territories are key partners in implementing the government's objective of planting 2 billion trees. Working closely with them, we now have a total of 9 agreements in principle and 8 contributions agreements signed, which is 5 AIPs and 4 contribution agreements more than the time of the audit, with more to come. Minister Wilkinson has engaged with his counterparts to reiterate his commitment to working with them. We seek to support their plans, whether to restore habitat for species at risk to recover after a wildfire or to adapt and help manage their forests in a changing climate. As I mentioned, this is a long-term program, and we need to be constantly looking at what adjustments we need to make. The wildfire season has caused us to reconsider how best to go about increasing Canada's forest cover. We have an opportunity to think ahead of us about how the 2 billion trees commitment, in light of this current and unprecedented context, will ensure that our forests are resilient to a changing climate. We are actively engaged with all partners to align agreements, partnerships, and funding in order to best move ahead. On forest carbon, we'll continue to partner with Environment and Climate Change Canada to produce world-class greenhouse gas emission estimates using methodology supported by more than 100 peer-reviewed research papers. We continue our efforts to stay current with the latest advancements in this field. For instance, the 2023 budget, as part of its investments in forest and forest workers, included funding to improve our forest data and reporting. Again, this aligns with our commitments under the Audit Management Action Plan and in response to the helpful recommendations on forest carbon reporting. And we'll continue to work closely with Environment and Climate Change Canada to improve the transparency of reports on historical and projected forest sector emissions. Our regular discussions with forestry experts and stakeholders means we are aware of the best available science, data, and practices, as well as where we can improve. Our modeling of tools will continue to evolve thanks to scrutiny by experts and peer review processes. We're proud our reporting methods align with internationally accepted practices, as the Commissioner noted. That means we produce a big picture report that collectively reflects human impacts such as harvesting, regeneration, fire suppression, and conservation. This method of reporting meets the reporting guidelines of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. To conclude, there is no solution to climate change without forests. We remain committed to the delivery of the goals of the 2 Billion Trees program, and we continue to adjust and adapt to realities on the ground, ensuring a flexible approach. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to receiving questions from the committee.
Thank you very much. And now from the Department of the Environment, Mr. Tremblay, Deputy Minister, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to recognize the fact that we are gathered today on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, whom we acknowledge as custodians of the land and waters of this region since time immemorial.
with the committee to discuss the Commissioner's audit recommendations relative to the Report 1 on forest and climate change. This report focuses on the 2 billion trees in particular. Planting trees on a large scale is fundamental in mitigating climate change in Canada. It helps capture carbon, it helps restoring wildlife and its habitat, and it helps restoring that biodiversity. It makes forests and surrounding communities more resilient to risk, such as floods and wildfire, and Canadians have seen that last summer. Both Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada welcome the findings of the report. The departments formally agree with the recommendations and have developed action plans to address them. Tout d'abord, nous convenons qu'il est essentiel que les rapports.
First of all, we agree that the carbon report should be studied independently. Canada takes into account all this in its annual reports, in its GHG reports that is presented within the framework of the UNFCCC.
Projected 2030 GHG emission and policy impacts on the biennial reports, also under the UNFCCC. Both reports include the emissions and removal that results from management of Canadian forests. They both undergo an in-depth, science-based technical review by independent experts in accordance with international guidelines. And they are both published online for transparency. But international reporting documents can be quite complex and hard to follow. And Canada must ensure information is clearly communicated to public, and especially for the decision makers. ECCC needs to demonstrate more clearly how past and future changes in land management practices affect projected emissions, for example. En 2022, le ministère a...
In 2022, ECCC started publishing more detailed data on land use, forestry emissions, and accounting projections. ECCC also continues to explore other ways to provide additional open data as a supplement to the National Inventory and the Biennial Report.
Important for us. The department is working to identify information gaps in carbon reporting and get to complementary inputs that is needed. ECCC has engaged with experts and stakeholders through multiple fora, and we will continue to do that. We also have engaged in dialogue with environmental groups that have published reports critical of forest carbon reporting in Canada. The issue these partners raise and the improvements they suggest will be addressed in future versions of the Interdepartmental Improvement Plan for Forest and Harvested Woods Products Greenhouse Gas Estimates. Together, at NARCAN and us, we are considering using more contextual information when reporting on progress towards 2022 to 2026 Federal Sustainable Development Strategy greenhouse gas target. The Commissioner is right. There is no solution to climate change in Canada that does not include forest. Reaching the government's objective of planting 2 billion trees is important to reach our targets. And better reporting on ECCC science related to forest emission is part of it. ECCC and NRCan are determined to overcome challenges, and I want to thank all the members and committee and also the Commissioner for their important work. I look forward to discussing with you.
Thank you very much. We'll begin our first round now. Mr. McCauley, who's joining us virtually, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Our Commissioner DeMarco, thanks for your report. Before I start, Mr. Vandergriff, congratulations on your appointment. I think this is, in committee, the third different department we've seen you with. Commissioner DeMarco, your comments on the failures of Natural Resources and Environment Canada seem to mirror very closely the issues that we had brought to light in your study on green hydrogen. Like, what is the issue with the departments? Is it a lack of communication? Is it a lack of leadership? Is it a lack of appointing one department in charge?
So we've seen a pattern of problems in our various different audits relating to climate change in the last 3 years with respect to Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada. Here we see some similarities with problems we identified in our Emissions Reduction Fund report in terms of double counting. That's an emerging issue with this 2 billion trees program.
How do we get
see
past
unrealistic
this
assumptions
problem
as well
with these two departments?
Pardon me?
How do we get past the problems that seem to come from these two departments?
So we've had a long list of recommendations trying to get at that very thing, and we are in the midst of trying to consolidate those recommendations in our next climate report for the fall, which I hope to be back for to speak to as well. But coordination, realistic assumptions, avoiding double counting, these are among the patterns that we've seen. More reasonable modeling, more transparency. There's a litany of issues that if we could see some progress on, we'd have much more credible numbers from Canada. We'd also hopefully start to see real progress ultimately in reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Was this program with the government, were they too focused on an announcement and not focused enough on the actual delivery, or was it just too impractical to begin with?
Well, as you're aware,
we're far away from our goals.
Yes, so this program was announced as a federal initiative, but as you know, most Crown land in Canada is managed by the provinces and territories. So as I've termed it before in previous appearances before other committees, the federal government was essentially an obligate collaborator with other entities for this to work. But it was rolled out before those agreements were in place. And you could say perhaps the cart was ahead of the horse somewhat, because the important sounding objective of 2 billion trees was announced before the ducks were in a row in terms of the agreements with those who would be needed to implement it.
We call it A for announcement, D for delivery. Am I reading this right? 1.22, paragraph 1.22 of a report, that this plan will be a net contributor to GHG emissions, at least for close to another decade.
So yes, if you look at paragraph 1.22 and exhibit 1.4 together, you see that this is a long-term project. In the first 10 years, there's not going to be any help in sequestering carbon.
But let me just interrupt you. So it's going to add to our GHG emissions, this program. You say it's a long-term, but we may, from looking at the numbers, we may never actually even come close to achieving our planting goals. And then further in the report, there's a comment about the issue of whether the trees will be reharvested right away. So will we actually get to a point where it reduces greenhouse gases?
Yeah, we should. So having regard to the issues you're raising with respect to survival rates and permanence, but we shouldn't abandon programs just because they don't show returns in the immediate future. Climate change is a long-term problem, and addressing it on the tree planting side means that the payoff is multi-decades from now, not in the first 10 years.
Great. How far back is achieving our goals been pushed by the inability to achieve the tree planting goals?
So they're off to quite a slow start, and there's a dispute between our office and the departments as to what should count now in terms of double counting from another program. But looking specifically at our report, we noted that they were roughly on track in year one, 2021, but fell well behind in 2022. We audited this at an early stage with the hope of helping them. Sorry.
Okay. When do we actually start seeing GHG reductions under what looks like a really delayed rollout?
Likely around 2032 or 2031 would be where the graph dips from above zero to below zero and goes from a source to a sink.
Great. Thanks, Commissioner DeMarco. Mr. Vandergraaf and Mr. Trombley, very quickly to both of you. Mr. Vandergraaf first, will you be able to achieve the goals as originally set out? If not, when will it be achieved?
We are committed to achieving the goals, Mr. Chair. We have a lot
committing and actually doing our different things. Will we achieve these goals?
We made a lot of progress, and we're implementing the recommendations. There's a lot more work to do yet as well.
Can you provide in writing to the committee when you expect to achieve the goals? And I'm out of time, Mr. Trombley. Would you do the same for us as well, please? And thanks very much.
Thank you. Could I just get kind of is that okay, Mr. Trombley?
But I think on the goal of the trees, that would be probably better for NRCan to respond, to be honest.
Okay, well, so.
No, for Mr. Vandergraaf.
No, I thought you'd ask for both. I was going to ask Mr. Vandergraaf as well. So is that something that can be done? Mr.
Yes,
Vandergraaf?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I just wanted to double check. I just like to ensure that witnesses are aware of the requests coming in. So, all right. Turning now to Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses here that are prepared to testify to this very important report that we're dealing with. We saw devastating wildfires impact families, communities, and businesses across Canada this past summer, and experts are warning of a similarly damaging wildfire season this summer. In fact, it could be argued that with the low snow cover, it could be much worse. So to Mr. Vandergrift, does the 2 Billion Trees program fund tree planting in deforested areas or areas impacted by wildfires? Mr. Vandergrift?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The program does fund tree planting in areas affected by forest fires. And in fact, tree planting can play an important role in helping to respond to forest fires by increasing diversity of species planted, enhancing resilience in those areas, and combined with other efforts, such as, for example, the Fire Safe program, which the Government of Canada is providing support for, also assisting communities in trying to reduce, fuel load near communities and trying to support better resilience to respond to forest fires in the future.
So that kind of leads to my next question. If you could explain what other measures Narcan is taking to prepare for the upcoming wildfire season.
Perhaps I could invite Mr. Hargrove to reply to that.
Certainly. Thank you, Deputy. So there are a number of activities that NRCan undertakes to support in response to wildfire season. So one critical area is around decision support, where we work with the provinces and territories, provide fire behavior predictive modeling and data and those sorts of things to actually help with on-the-ground response. So there's a lot of work that we're doing in that area, and it's certainly a key area of focus, and planning for that is well underway, and we do that in collaboration with other departments such as Public Safety and Environment and Climate Change Canada as well. There are also a number of recent investments that the government has made in terms of wildfire. So it's around $1 billion total in recent years for things like equipment and training, fire smart efforts for communities, as the deputy mentioned. We're working on research and modernizing information systems, those sorts of things. There's also a mission that we're working on with Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Canadian Space Agency called Wildfire Sat that is also aiming in the longer term to really help with those monitoring efforts. And we're also developing a center of expertise on wildland fire that will be launched in the near future as well. So lots of activities going on in that area.
Taken by the Commissioner covered only a portion of the planting period. Can you please share with this committee what progress has been made, if any, with respect to planting during the entire season? I guess maybe, is that Mr. Vandergrift, or I'm not sure which one of you?
I'll turn it over to the table there, maybe Mr. Labonte, Mr. Hargrove.
Thank you for the question. As Deputy Minister Vandergrift mentioned in his opening remarks, we have signed additional agreements in principle and contribution agreements with provinces and territories. We've determined a distinctions-based approach for the funding that will deliver to Indigenous communities, recognizing the individual needs and different priorities of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities across the country. We have also engaged in an agreement with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities so that they can support planting in smaller cities that don't necessarily have in-house capacity to do large-scale planting. And we continue to sign agreements with a variety of partners, provinces, territories, NGOs, community associations, and cities. Right now, we have about 200 agreements in place, or we have agreements in place, or we're negotiating them to plant about 380 million trees.
Time.
From now until the end of the program in 2031.
Okay, and are you on track for your management action plan in response to the CESD audit? What's the progress to date?
We have drafted the management action plan and followed up on the additional commitment that we made on the two commitments that we made to finish in December the operational plan, as well as the guidance on single species planting that the Deputy Minister mentioned. So we're on track we've already finished those, and we're on track to complete the other commitments in that plan as well.
Okay, so at the time of the report, Minister Wilkinson said many of the recommendations were already being actioned. Can somebody, like I know you've said that you've already got agreements or tentative agreements with many of the provinces of territory. What other recommendations have you made substantial progress on? Anyone?
Several of the recommendations and some of the discussions that came out during the audit, including with some of the audit principal, with the audit principal and her staff, We have stepped up efforts to communicate with stakeholders, so we hold more regular webinars, we provide more guidance. We've gone out particularly to more conferences to engage more people, to try to understand the issues and the challenges they face and putting together planting projects. We have started to develop further guidance and a plan for monitoring in the long run. So we will have not only the assurance of making sure that the proposals that we approve are good ones, to have the right tree, right place, right time, but also to put in remote sensing so that we can keep track of those trees in the long run.
Thank you very much, and that is time. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés. Vous avez parole.
Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for coming. In spite of the geographic distance, lots of questions have been raised in this report. Are we talking about very ambitious objectives? Lots of doubts have been raised, some even by stakeholders who are aware or who read the report. So I have a question that was submitted by one of them, and I would like to raise it because I find it very interesting. A recent article, a scientific article in the Hill Times last week said the government had underestimated emissions from forests by about 100 megatons per year. Significant. The commissioner, you also raised concerns about the lack of transparency in the declaration of GHG emissions from forest exploitation. Could you tell us more about that, Mr. Commissioner?
Oui, bien sûr.
Yes, of course. During the second part of our report, we concluded that there was lack of transparency with calculations of emissions accounts. Estimates were changing year after year. That is document number 1.8, where you can see that 1 year we're looking at data. It was clear that emissions were sent out to the atmosphere, but some of them were taken out of the atmosphere. So there are lots of problems with that. It's not transparent. It's not exact, so there's inconsistency. How do you explain that lack of transparency? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it negligence? I'm not sure what their intentions were, but I don't think it's deliberately that they are doing the calculations. Are you saying it's deliberately or not deliberately? No, it's not deliberately. Thank you for that clarification. But we can see that the stakeholders and decision makers, well, can't really look at the data and decide or determine the changes that need to be made with forestry management. It's impossible to look at the data and to say, yes, we will need a lot more restoration. We will need to restore or preserve more forest. So this is something that needs to be improved significantly. Also, in your report, recommendation 1.64 concerns the approach taken by Canada to estimate and declare forest emissions. And conversely, and this question goes to environment or natural resources, the response talks about the ongoing consultations, but there's no commitment made to review the framework used on counting forest carbon or accounting for forest carbon. I think the approach should be reviewed. Please, talking about consultations is not really a response. Could you please make a commitment today to review the approach being used by Canada to take into account forestry carbon? I will start and allow my friends from natural resources who are the lead on the review of the framework to speak afterwards. Calculation of forestry is calculated. It's complicated when we are calculating emissions. It's a lot more complicated when we compare forestry emissions to other emissions. So we always need to do a review. Internationally, it's done annually. So the review process is respected internationally. There's a continuous peer review that goes on. So there's a matter of transparency on how we communicate, how we make sure that decisions are made. And as the commissioner said, at the provincial level, there are things that we're addressing. So I think that natural resources with our teams are now working with the provinces and with various stakeholders on a way of reviewing the framework. And I'll leave it up to them to answer the question.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Mr. Tremblay.
Yes, we are reviewing the accounting approach, and so the consultations are part of that review, and part of the challenge around the accounting approach is that there are a couple of different approaches that are used internationally. Canada uses one, which is called a reference level approach. A lot of other countries use which is really scientifically based, and there are a lot of strong reasons for using that approach. However, it is less transparent than the simpler approach, which is called net-net. And so what we're doing is reviewing that. We're consulting with stakeholders and experts to...
Est-ce que vous avez un échéancier, monsieur, que vous pourriez parler?
Do you have a timetable you could share with us when it comes to the study and the review of Canada's approach?
Yes, the accounting approach, the consultations are underway with the...
Pas sur les consultations, sur...
I'm not talking about the consultations. I'm talking about the new approach. I understand.
The consultations are ongoing right now with the idea of taking a decision on the approach going forward by the end of the calendar year.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I too want to thank the Environment Commissioner for this report and for all those present here today in this important work. And I think it's one that has to be really grounded in the fact that climate change and the age of consequence is here. We're experiencing that. We see that work. My own family in northern Alberta experienced multiple wildfires in the last 5 years. Wildfires that get worse and worse every single year, and this last year was the most horrific year. I watched elders run from their homes, be surrounded completely by fire, and we in many cases didn't have the emergency preparedness to actually help them. I'm pleased to say that today much of the rebuilding efforts by the community have been met. We lost over half of the community of East Prairie Métis Settlement, one of the largest communities that occupied forests in Canada, the southern portion of the boreal forest. The wildfires we're experiencing in Alberta alone, were experienced by Canadians across the country. Not ever before have I ever seen the amount of smoke and the amount of environmental effect that was not just isolated to the region where fire began, but to many urban centers. Edmonton was choking because of the wildfires it could not maintain in the north. We see that reality in Quebec, simultaneous to historic levels of flooding. Canadians should know that when we speak about climate change, we're speaking about the very drastic and terrible situation that we're in. And this has been my frustration for many years, and most particularly as a member of Parliament, to know that we have programs designed to help combat climate change by way of the reduction of emissions. What I find frustrating is that these programs, time and time and again, in particular this 2 billion tree program, there's so many inconsistencies with the goal of trying to actually reduce emissions. In the report, we see, for example, that there's a lifespan on looking at Exhibit 1.4. It's found on page 7 of the report. It looks at, for example, a period of time, a time schedule that's going to see eventually the transformation of those trees that are planted into a carbon sink so that we can begin to actually get a hold of some of the immense emissions that we have. The concern I have, though, is that if we don't reach the goal of planting trees in a way that's diverse in a way that's going to provide the kind of human qualities that are also important to a forest, like we see in natural forests, like the boreal forest? How is, this is to the Commissioner, how is the graph you see here that's portrayed in your report under Exhibit 1.4, how does it take into account, or what information did you review that took into account, or does not take into account, the issues of forest management practices of humans today? I know that's a portion of your report that I want you to highlight. And the second question is on the instance of how does this demographic, or how does the demographic information here change based on the fact that they won't reach their target?
Yes, so, and thank you for reminding us of the human face to all of this. We're talking about graphs and trees and so on, but it wasn't that long ago that that the skies were orange here in Ottawa as well as Edmonton and elsewhere because of the incredible fire season that we had, and it was felt not only here in southern Canada but also in the United States from the fires in Canada. So this is, you know, a sign of what can happen with catastrophic climate change. It's not just an academic issue. We're starting to see it in our daily lives, and it affects communities, especially those living in forested environments. With respect to your questions, so if they do succeed in planting 2 billion incremental trees, and they act on the new agreements in principle and new agreements, which are a good sign, then we would expect the payoff to start, as I said earlier, around 2031, 2032, and you start to see the small trees that are planted today becoming large enough to become a carbon sink. But there's more to a forest than trees, and I think you were getting that as well. There are livelihoods of communities, there's the biodiversity associated with it, and so on. So it was quite disappointing to see the partial disagreement with our recommendation to provide incentives to habitat restoration work for all project streams. Natural Resources Canada did not accept that part of the recommendation, even though it's quite evident that both from a biodiversity point of view and a community point of view that a more diverse forest has better benefits for biodiversity and human health, but also from a resilience point of view.
Just because I think you mentioned a really brief a comment that's important, which is the partial agreement. And I want to understand from Natural Resource Canada why that partial agreement exists, and does Natural Resource Canada understand the very important requirement of biodiversity?
Maybe I could start, Mr. Chair. To the member, first off, we wanted to acknowledge the impacts of forest fires on your community that you highlighted and on people, and that's very important. I want to note on biodiversity, we do provide extra incentives for the programs with provinces and territories to support projects that increase biodiversity and deal with habitat. Those are more expensive trees to plant, and it becomes at some point an issue of how we best use the funds to achieve the overall objective. That is why at some point we try to advance habitat, increasing biodiversity and habitat protection through the province and territories agreements, but not through all of them, is the view at this point.
And I'm sure Mr. Deja will have a follow-up question down the road. Turn now to Mr. Stewart. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for the audit. As you may know, I represent an area of New Brunswick where forestry is a huge part of our daily lives in Miramichi. New Brunswick is the most heavily forested Canadian province. The forestry sector remains New Brunswick's largest industry, contributing more than $1.5 billion to the economy annually and making up 5% of the total provincial economy. Forestry industry supports more than 24,000 full-time jobs, many seasonal. My mother was a tree planter, probably from the time I was 12 until I was maybe 17 or 18. It was a very difficult job. She used to always talk about it. My dad is a logger, and my mother's father was a contractor for what was one of the largest paper mills in Canada, former repap location. So the province's prioritization of biodiversity and achievement of gains through Nature Legacy Initiative has resulted in legal protection of 10% of the province's land and fresh water. New Brunswick is in a unique position where half of the forest is owned by the public as Crown land and the other half is privately owned. The management system on Crown land relies on thousands of people each year from government, Crown timber licenses, First Nations, contractors, truckers, many small businesses, and the public. On average, the productive Crown forest, 3 million hectares, is estimated to grow at approximately 3.1 cubic meters each year. This means that every 10 years, almost one tractor-trailer load of wood grows on every hectare. Over 900,000 hectares of Crown forest land across New Brunswick are conserved and protected. That's equivalent to over 1.5 million football fields. Over the last 10 years, an average of 13,000 hectares have been planted each year on Crown land. The total accumulated areas of plantations in Crown land today is about 16% of the Crown forest. The annual tree planting program is an investment for the future of the working forest in New Brunswick. The number of hectares planted each year is prescribed by the long-term forest management plan, which considers the balance of trees, species in the forest, the required habitat for animals, and the interest in maintaining the long-term sustainable wood supply. Important stat coming up. 210 million seedlings are committed to be planted in New Brunswick by 2030. Forest fires, another interesting statistic. Incredibly, 97.6% of wildfires in 2022 in New Brunswick were caused by human beings, people, and not climate change. The reason I provided all the background on the forest industry in New Brunswick is to show you we are a true leader in forest management, including tree planting. The question for me, and you somewhat answered it early on in your deliberations, and this question would be for Natural Resources Canada, but if there's somebody that's better suited to answer it, I'm okay with that. I noticed it's taken you until now, in the third year of your program, to develop nine in principle relationships with the provinces and territories, and 8 of them are signed. And the reason this program is failing, or in many respects, 2 billion trees, I'm going to say this, 2 billion trees it's not a modest target, but I, for one, think, based on the fact that my own province could do a quarter of it, it's achievable. The problem and why you failed, I believe, is because you tried to recreate the wheel. The provinces are already doing this the right way. That's where your relationship needed to be. Can you explain why that relationship wasn't the first one you built, and whether or not you've currently got one with the province of New Brunswick? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. We talk very often with New Brunswick and took a lot of interest in the forest strategy that the province recently put out. I think a lot of the goals that New Brunswick has there lines very well with what we're trying to achieve with 2 billion trees, including trying to adapt their species mix in the province for climate change to maintain all of those different values that you mentioned. With the provinces, we rely on them to tell us what they would want to do in a way that suits the jurisdiction, the land, the species, and the things that they need to achieve. Everyone is different. There are different ecosystems, different requirements all across the country. So we do rely on the provinces. Like the Commissioner said, those relationships are really very important with us.
Sorry, I have to cut you off. I do appreciate your answer, but I'm trying to figure out why it's taken so long, and why signing those agreements right off the get-go wasn't the top priority. Because regardless of what the provinces are currently doing, New Brunswick, as an example, could easily have been very beneficial to your program. So I'm asking why it's taken so long. Like why has it taken 3 years?
The agreements with the provinces and territories have been a priority for us all along. And in some cases, the provinces are going to take some time because they have their own decision-making processes to go through and planning that they want to do. We are very well advanced, very far advanced with New Brunswick in
so you haven't signed an agreement with New Brunswick?
That is the time, Mr. Stewart. I appreciate your round of questioning from my home province as well. Mr. Chen, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Still didn't answer my question.
I want to begin by thanking all the witnesses here today and to thank the Auditor General for this important report. This conversation today really reminds me of my previous work as a local school trustee, during which I started an annual tree planting in what is now the Rouge National Urban Park. And to recall the children were so enthusiastic to get their hands dirty, to go and plant the trees for the day. And not only was it a rewarding experience for them, it was good for the environment. We were strengthening our local biodiversity, supporting an ecological corridor, and truly a worthwhile initiative that I was able to help lead for the time that I was on the school board. And to connect that to this tremendous undertaking of Natural Resources Canada, who is leading the 2 billion tree planting program, this is incredibly ambitious. It is one that is happening across the country. It's one that requires working together with provinces and territories in a cross-government approach. Acknowledging the mandate that the Environment Minister has in supporting the planting of the 2 billion trees, can Natural Resources Canada please speak to how other departments and programs like Parks Canada or the Low Carbon Economy Fund have contributed to our progress in achieving 2 billion trees?
I'll invite one of my colleagues in the room to jump in on that one.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we have 5 types of partners, one of which are federal governments, federal departments, because as you say, federal departments do planting, like Parks Canada, like Veterans Affairs. So we have partnerships with several departments under the program to plant incremental trees. Those have to be beyond business as usual. So, for example, the Department of National Defense does do some maintenance on its land base, but that wouldn't necessarily count for us because it's not additional trees to what they would normally do. For the Low Carbon Economy Fund, the trees that were planted by the provinces and territories under that fund were incremental to business as usual. And the reporting that was provided by the provinces enabled us to, or provinces and territories, enabled us to know how many trees were planted. So there was some clarity in the reporting that allowed us to include those trees in the numbers that we're looking at to fulfill the government's commitment to plant 2 billion. The plan for the 2 billion tree program at the beginning was to ensure that other government department programs that can contribute to that commitment, the 2 billion commitment, where the trees are incremental, where there's sufficient reporting to know that that activity happened, that we would include it as well.
Some of the natural disasters that are happening, including forest fires caused by climate change. So outside of the 2 billion trees, Natural Resources Canada is also tasked with supporting the forest sector in terms of fighting against forest-killing pests, wildfires, and ensuring sustainable practices. Can you talk a bit more about what the department is doing to provide these supports?
Absolutely. I mean, I would first mention the announcement in Budget 2023 for an additional $370-some million to support forest sector programming aimed at innovation, decarbonization, looking at new products and new ways of doing things, as well as improving the data that would go into the carbon estimates that some of our colleagues on the panel here have been talking about. We also at NRCan have had programs and interventions now and in the past for pest outbreaks, whether that's spruce budworm in the east or mountain pine beetle in the west, as well as the investments that my colleague, Mr. Hargrove, mentioned on wildland fire management.
Thank you very much. Turning to the Commissioner, we've seen through this report from the AG that no program is perfect. There are always challenges in reaching the goals that are being set out. So I would like to ask you this. Can you tell us, do you believe that this is a valuable program? Should the government continue to work to achieve this ambitious 2 billion tree goal? Is this worthwhile?
Yes, it is nice to see a program that has such a long-term horizon, because sometimes in government we tend to focus too much on short-termism, and this is a theme in lesson number 8 of our Climate Lessons Learned report of 2021 that we were here before this committee about 2 years ago. So I don't want to discourage departments from taking on long-term projects, even if they have it takes a while to see the fruits of the labor, for example. That's why we put in Exhibit 1.4 to say that don't look just to 2030 and see that it's a carbon source. Look all the way out to 2040, 2050, 2060, and you'll see the fruits of the labor being accruing in that period. So it is worthwhile doing. It should be an incremental tree program and not counting trees that are going to be planted anyway, as we've just heard. There's some question as to whether that includes the Low Carbon Economy Fund trees or not. The department has chosen to include those now as of this summer. We didn't have an indication about that when we issued the report, and there'll obviously be fewer benefits if it's not entirely a tree planting program, but it's a tree planting and tree counting program. So we can talk about that more later.
Thank you very much,
definitely
Mr.
it is
DeMarco.
worthwhile to invest in the long term by planting trees.
Thank you. Puis encore une fois, Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. I have a question for the Commissioner, a direct question. Do you know who came up with the 2 billion figure? Where does that figure come from, if you know? It dates back to 2019.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. Inaudible for the interpreter. It came following a promise that was made, so it was initially a political promise that was imposed on public servants. Very well. Question. Do you think, one, well, your report is very clear. At this point, if we continue the way we are going, we will not attain our objectives. But do you think that this objective is attainable? Answer. Is it achievable, the $2 billion figure? Yes. That is why we finalized the audit this early in the program, because we also want improvements to be made. We want the program to be successful, so we have enough time to raise the level and achieve the 2031 target. But they need lots of partnerships, and they need to focus, as I said before, not only on trees, but also on forest. Exactly, not only on quantity, but also on quality and the speed of construction. Okay. Now, my colleague here talked about forest fires, wildfires. Several of my colleagues from the bloc experienced forest fires on their territory, particularly in the north of Quebec. It was horrible, the pictures we saw during the summer. We know, and this is something that was mentioned, we talked about resilience and biodiversity at several levels. Single cropping is not the only solution when we want to plant trees again. According to you, Mr. Commissioner, at this point, are we focusing more on attaining a figure we set as an objective instead of attaining a climate change objective? Let's remember that there's a 2 billion tree target, but there are 3 objectives. It's not only carbon capture, but there's also biodiversity and well-being. So if we focus on monocultures or monocrops, we'll be targeting one of them. I'm sorry, your time is up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to return now to my question we left off on regards to the barriers. One barrier of diversifying that was just mentioned earlier, I believe, by Natural Resource Canada, and that was the fact that it's too expensive to be making diversified forests or diversified tree planting. This is a pretty large concern, and I'd say a red flag for the program, and one that's an immense vulnerability, considering that much of the targets for a healthy forest, that you can make a big monoculture forest, but it's going to die. It's just not going to have the ability to sustain itself, and it's going to actually add carbon ultimately if it fails. And so I think diversity is a requirement of a successful forest that is to be a very good carbon sink. I think that's an important piece to that discussion. And so maybe to the Natural Resources Canada, what is the cost that's going to ensure that you have the ability to do the amount of tree planting that you've committed to, in addition to ensuring that it's diversified? What is the number of deficit?
Mr. Chair, if I could invite my colleagues to speak also, I think there's an important distinction between habitat protection and biodiversity, so maybe I can ask them to speak to that as well.
Well, just to be certain that you have the question correct, you mentioned that the barrier to diversifying the types of trees that will be planted is cost. So I'm led to believe that the types of trees you're planting are the cheapest trees you could possibly get, or they're a type of set of trees that in other ways would have to be part of a different or larger project plan, so maybe a provincial plan. But I want to know specifically, to the comment made by Natural Resources, what, like you said it was a financial barrier, so you've obviously costed this somehow. What is the cost to ensure that the trees you plant are truly going to belong to a diversified forest? What is the cost?
I think we need a point of clarification, which is that when the Deputy Minister Vandergrift was talking about habitat restoration, he was talking about the extra costs that you have to put in order to prepare a space to restore habitat for species at risk.
Okay, sure.
But
add that to the number. What's the number?
But on the other hand, there are all kinds of ways that we get at quality. For biodiversity, for habitat generally, whether it's species at risk or not, including experts reviews panels, making sure
Mr.
that
DeMarco,
we get
did you review any
proposals.
information when you were auditing this as to any costing that the departments had done, in particular costing to programs that would result in a diversified tree planting
very brief
program?
response, please.
Yeah, the first we heard of the cost barrier was in the response to Recommendation 47, where they said, given that habitat restoration is significantly more expensive, additional incentives for habitat restoration work would reduce funding available. So they looked at it as
Thank
a
you. No,
zero-sum.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We can come back to this. Mr. Nader, you have the floor, but I understand you would like to lend some of your time to Mr. Stewart, who's going to lead off here. Mr. Stewart, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Nader. I was going to get back to my questions with, as far as New Brunswick goes. New Brunswick is a leader in long-term modeling of forest resources. In my opinion, we're number one. I'm not a complete expert on it, but we're very good at forestry. And I think the opportunity that you missed here, and one of the biggest reasons why you're failing, is because every province has its own forestry plan, and they manage it in some form or another. And I'm sure they're all very different from each other. They have First Nations or Indigenous communities that have expertise. They have companies that have expertise, Crown and private land, both. The opportunity is there, and the expertise in labor to plant more trees. It's there. So I'm going to go back to my original question, and I don't care who answers it. I want the answer, yes or no. Do you have an agreement signed with the province of New Brunswick?
We don't yet, although we are very, very far along in our conversations with New Brunswick. One of the issues is that you are absolutely right. Provinces already do a significant amount of planning, and they already have expertise. They do that as in business as usual. What we're seeking with 2 billion trees in order to achieve all the objectives of the program is something incremental to business as usual, which for them, they want to consider how they're going to do it and how they're going to put it in place and how to best use those resources.
I appreciate that answer. I just think when you look at that expertise, the bureaucracy is never going to go out and plant those trees. You guys are tasked. You have I think it was a $3 billion initiative. So the investment dollars were clearly there, rightly or wrongly so, in my opinion, to achieve this goal. And the reason why you're behind is the number one province for forestry management is New Brunswick, and it should have been your top priority to find out which trees New Brunswick wants to plant, which trees they need to plant, and make a deal right off the bat, and then move on to the other provinces. And I think you'd have signed those deals much quicker. And I really believe 2 billion trees is this project is clearly way behind schedule, and I don't know if it'll ever be achieved, but it was achievable if you had done it right, and the investment dollars are clearly there, because the $3 billion can't be just for a bureaucracy. You're talking about physically, manually, human beings and equipment out there planting trees. Trees have to be planted. They're not going to be planted by people like, I'm not going to plant them. You're not going to plant them. So my point is, you had the expertise and the money, and that's my point, and that's why you're failing. Go ahead, Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to make full use of my 2 minutes. First of all, I note that the most successful tree planting program at a municipal level in North America is actually the County of Wellington, in my riding of Perth Wellington, which is doing exceptional work and have been doing that for 2 decades now. So just want to put a quick plug there and waste more of my time that is now drifting away. Deputy Minister Vandergrift, my question to you is, when did NRCan become aware of the government's plan to plant 2 billion trees? At what date did they become aware of that commitment?
I don't have it, Mr. Chair. I do not know of a specific date. I'll invite my colleagues if they're able to provide an answer to that.
Could the department follow up and let us know on what date you became aware of, whether it was when it was announced publicly or whether it was any you became aware in advance of that commitment?
I assume that's I just want to get ahead on that. That's possible.
Certainly, yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate that. I want to switch to the Commissioner, Mr. DeMarco. 1.37, you discussed the permanence of planted trees and how. As of yet, there's not a commitment to keep those trees actually in the ground. So I'm curious, your suggestion that it would become negative, carbon negative by about 2030, give or take. When you're doing your modeling, when you're looking at that, what considerations did you take into account about the permanence of the trees that have been planted thus far and that will be planted in the future, whether they stay in the ground or don't stay in the ground?
Yes, that concern of ours is illustrated in recommendation 43, where we recommended that they have a long-term monitoring plan to assess health and survival of the trees planted and targets for the program's performance indicators relating to that. So these benefits, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and human health, will only accrue if a good number of the trees survive. And that was a significant weakness that we identified. We've modeled out based on the tree planting being successful, but it's not a given that they will be successful, especially with the increased incidence of forest fires.
I'm afraid that is the time, Mr. Nader. Mr. Stewart is down again, so maybe he'll give you some time back. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you all for coming today. The environment is definitely very important. So rather than having annual calls for proposals in December 2022, the department changed to multi-year project proposals. Is this helping to reduce the gaps in delivery, and will the department be able to meet the planting deadlines? And that's for Mr. Vandergrift.
Why don't I just pass it to the colleagues in the room?
Yes, absolutely. We launched an ongoing call for proposals, which means that we get proposals at any time from anyone who wants to put in a proposal for planting. It allows us to be a little bit more nimble and faster in responding to proponents. Having calls for proposals at defined times was creating kind of a false cycle that didn't allow us to be as nimble as we would want to be. It helps us to identify as well places where we could help connect organizations that want to plant with those who have expertise in planting, for example. So we find that we are also starting to help people develop those partnerships to get at part of the concern that the Commissioner raised around ensuring long-term survivability, and that when the tree goes in the ground, it's going in the ground in a way that will help it survive, and the survivability rates will be better.
So that would include follow-up monitoring as well?
It does include follow-up and monitoring and reporting throughout the life of the project. And as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at different ways that we can continue monitoring over the life of the trees, including sensors and remote monitoring.
If I can add to that, Budget 2023 recognized that and included an extra $53 million to the Department for data monitoring and data gathering to improve our ability to measure and understand the program's results and how it'll look over time. That includes new technology, but it also includes new methodologies and science to support the ability to do that.
So planting trees is backbreaking work. Is there, and it's difficult to attract, I think, enough labor. Is there an adequate action plan to address this? Because when you look at Exhibit 1.3, you go from here in terms of, planting the tree targets to like this.
Certainly, one of the, we have some funding in the $2 billion tree program to look at capacity building and also to conduct science and research. One of the projects that we've undertaken is to assess the survivability of seedlings that are planted through or distributed through using drones, which might be a way to deal with labor shortages or with difficulties in accessing the sites that our partners would want to plant at. We don't have the results from that pilot yet to know a little bit more about whether the seedlings would survive in sufficient numbers to make that worthwhile. But certainly it is something that we talk to our partners about. And when it comes to, for example, the provinces and territories, they would already have systems in place to have the labor for their usual, business as usual planting that they can also rely on for this incremental planting too.
Well, it's good to learn that you have drones. I still remember planting in my own garden. And even if it's seedlings, it's still a lot of work. The department said they wanted to raise and publish some information on the gaps and issues raised by experts and environmental groups. What are some of these gaps and issues, and how do you plan to address it?
I think your comment refers to the remarks by Deputy Minister Tremblay.
Yeah, Lindsay can answer part of the question. You tell me if it's okay.
Thank you. One of the aspects of all of this is reporting on the greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, and there have been concerns raised to ensure that that Canada's official reporting of greenhouse gas estimates are as transparent and as accurate as possible. So some of the actions that we've taken recently include a plan to include in the next edition of Canada's National Inventory Report more disaggregated data when it comes to forests by provinces and territories. We've also recently undergone a review by a team of international experts that happened back in September. So we're waiting for that report of recommendations, which we will consider very seriously and implement over time. We're also looking closely at how we can improve the text in the report so that this very complicated topic can be more clearly articulated to those who read it. And last but not least, we're also updating the improvement plan for forestry estimates, which we hope to be made publicly available in the near future.
Thank you very much. We're going to begin now our third and final round, which involves 6 members questioning. I was going to cut the time back. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to be very firm about the time so we get through a full round. So, Mr. McCall, you have the floor for 5 minutes, and the time needs to include the answers as well. So just bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeMarco, could you explain in just clear language 1.23 your concerns about natural resources considering carbon offsets, it seems, and how it kind of goes against the grain of what this project is supposed to achieve?
Yes, it's another iteration of the potential for double counting or lack of additionality problem. So if offsets are not used properly, one project may be able to count twice in terms of tree planting and some sort of carbon offset. So we want to see these programs used to add value, not just double count things that are already counted in an offset program, for example.
Do you need a charger?
Okay. Mr. Van de Graaff, what is NRCan doing to address this concern?
Could I ask a team there to reply?
Oh, sure.
Chair. Sorry, Mr. McCauley.
Certainly. We certainly wouldn't want to see any double counting either. And so in the offsets space, there are two different markets. So there's compliance markets, and then there's voluntary markets. And we would certainly not allow any offsetting in a compliance market. That would.
Do you have that in that program or anything in writing to prevent that, or is it only we would like not to see?
Yes, there is written instructions around offsets. Go ahead, Monique.
In the written instructions that we have on the internet available for program applicants and in the program application guide, we can provide those to the
Commissioner
committee if you
DeMarco,
wish.
are you comfortable with what they've provided, that we're not going to have that issue?
I would like to see the results of that rather than just the instructions to make sure that it truly is avoiding double counting. So I can't guarantee it at this point.
How long will it take to see the results?
As Mr. Hargrove mentioned, if somebody is claiming in the compliance market, that means that the government, Environment Canada, would know if somebody is claiming that.
How long would it take to see those results?
It would take a very long number of years because a tree won't be valuable for offsets until it's grown almost to maturity, which means in some cases 20, 40, 60 years.
So it could end up double counting and we'll all be long retired before we actually catch it. I'll move on. Commissioner, sorry, I will move on, thanks. Commissioner DeMarco, do we have an updated forecast on the cost of this, the tree planting program? And does it adjust for the issues that we've talked about losing trees, whether it's to harvesting or to fires or dying out?
So we are still considering whether to follow up on this audit because of the changes in circumstances around the double counting with the low carbon emissions fund. We have the same question. For example, in paragraph 1.5, we said that they were going to spend up to $3.2 billion on the 2 billion trees, and then the breakdown is set out in paragraph 1.14. There was no indication there that they were going to get tens of millions of free trees from double counting from other programs. So is this $3.2 billion to plant 2 billion trees, or is it $3.2 billion to plant 1 point something billion trees? We don't know that. We also don't know whether the sequestration will be
Who's responsible
effective.
for giving us a proper estimate? This is billions of dollars of taxpayers' money on a very, very flawed program. Like, who's responsible for putting forward firm costing?
The department should have provided that, and it's this committee more
Which
than
department? NRCan?
Yes, for 2 billion trees, NRCan, yes.
Great. Mr. Van de Graaff, would you be able to provide to the committee an updated price backed up with details that addresses the permanence issue? Commissioner DeMarco, how many trees would we actually have to plant with the issues around the permanence, knowing that we'll lose some to actually achieve 2 billion? Is it going to be 2.5? Is it 3? Or do we have to settle the permanence issue first?
So they committed to planting 2 billion. the department realizes that they won't get the benefits from those $2 billion if most of them die. But if you wanted to have $2 billion survive, then you'd have to factor in the survivorship rate. I don't know what it is for the first 2 years and whether the department can tell you that, but the commitment was to plant 2 billion
Thank you.
trees.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. We will try to come back to that.
Thanks very much.
Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank you for your patience with me and my French. I'm practicing my French.
Questions en français. Au CADD,
in a journal, the government of Quebec was asking the federal government to review the provisions of the program, which stipulated that trees could not be harvested in the long term, and is asking that a number of trees could be cut. Do you think that this proposal for amendments will allow the program to extend its objectives to increase forest coverage or cover and ensure restoration of nature?
Merci bien.
Thank you. You are not the only one who needs to practice their French. I need to do the same, but I have lots of opportunities to do so as commissioner now. I just read the article today as well. It's a new development, so I do not know if the federal government will resolve that debate with Quebec. I would like to hear what the department thinks, what they intend to do to resolve that debate with Quebec, as we read this morning in the newspaper.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Peut-être, Monsieur le Président, je pourrais répondre.
Mr. Chair, I can respond. We also just received a letter. We are continuing discussions on that situation with the government of Quebec. I think we agree with Quebec that $1 billion could support an increase in restoring the lands that have been damaged by wildfires. But I also think that we will continue discussions to move forward the objectives of the program, which is to respond to the need to fight against climate change and to reap benefits for planting trees in the long term.
Merci.
Thank you.
If you want to talk about the acceptation of this proposal to amend or modify the program, what direction would you like to give to the federal government? To resolve the debate with the province of Quebec? That is not my role. It's not my role to give strategy and policy advice. It's a question for the department. Are they comfortable with what is being proposed by Quebec, or are they not comfortable? It's not my role to provide that kind of guidance.
Oui, on pourrait peut-être ajouter quelques éléments.
Maybe we can add something. It's important to have partners with provinces and territories. We continue to discuss. As we've said, we have reached a few agreements, and we continue to discuss with other provinces and territories. Quebec is one province. The letter is a new development for us. The minister will ask his colleague, I think in August, to reach agreements and speed up discussions. Quebec provided an answer. We received it this week, so discussions will continue with the province and with our counterparts to reach a solution if there's a possibility with them. Thank you. This is a question for Oren Ken about the proposal arising from Quebec. And given the terrible effects of forest fires in Quebec, how does the 2 billion trees program support the reforestation of the forests that were destroyed?
Turning now to Madame Secrétaire Desgagnés, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Mais c'est fantastique parce que
This is great. My colleagues opposite asked the questions that I would have asked. I was curious to know, why does the agreement with the Quebec government didn't come already? There were some agreements, and we know it slows down the process very quickly. Can anyone tell me quickly where are the discussions at and when you think that an agreement will be reached? Maybe I can answer, Mr. Chair. As my colleague mentioned, we received a letter from Quebec. We work closely with Quebec, and we will continue to discuss with Quebec to reach a solution. I think we share the same goals. We must find solutions by discussing with Quebec. The assessment of forest fire losses, was it done? And how does the federal government want to compensate for this within the program?
So there are a number of ways that we're talking to provinces and territories about using 2 billion tree funding to recover from fire. One is to replant in areas where fire is so hot that the forest won't come back naturally. Another is to help communities build fire breaks. And another would be to consider looking at things like species mix. Some of the points that were raised earlier about diversity also count when it comes to fire, because it may be that different species are better for...
Excusez-moi, j'ai très peu de temps, mais mon collègue le souligne.
My colleague said it. So there was a goal. It was 1.70 per tree. Were we planning to plant a greater diversity of tree for a more resilient tree? There is important price difference in. It's not the same price from Brampton to Sudbury. Why is that?
Not necessarily on species, but on how old the tree is and how long it has to grow in a nursery and how much the land needs to be prepared in advance. So yes, you can do different species for that lower cost.
Est-ce que vous pensez que $1.60?
Do you think that $1.70 is still doable, or was it a reasonable goal as an average price?
Depends very much on the circumstances and what is going to be planted and where. So if it's a place where you have to do a lot of work to prepare the land to take a tree, then that's going to be more expensive. $1.70 is, some of the projects that we come in, our contribution is still around $1, $2 per tree.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. I do know I want to return to the double counting. What a concern that is to me, to know that we have a situation where that was possible. I understand from reading the report, it's some issues related to methodology and frameworks not existing. To the Commissioner, DeMarco, how is it that you received that information, and what did you find in the process of reviewing the counting of the trees and other various programs that do similar initiatives? How did you see that that mistake was possible?
Yeah, so this emerged after the tabling of our report. In our report, we said at paragraph 1.19 and 120 where they were at in terms of their tree planting success in the first 2 years, and that was reflected in the exhibit on the next page. And this is important, especially for this committee, Public Accounts Committee. please note at page 26 of our report, we obtained from the entity, the department, confirmation that all known information that had been requested or could affect the findings or audit conclusion had been provided, and confirmation that the audit report was factually accurate. That's a very important step in the audit process. We were not told about these tens of millions of other trees. Perhaps they didn't know the exact number, but it was incumbent upon the department to tell us that it's not 16.5 million that they were going to count for 2022, but tens of millions above that. And it turns out those tens of millions additional trees were not from the 2 billion trees program. They were from the Low Carbon Economy Fund and had already been planted and funded under that program. So if you double count trees from other programs and other departments, that's not incremental. That's double counting, and it's obvious that the benefits for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and human health are diminished if you count the same tree twice in two different
Who's
programs.
responsible for counting the trees?
Natural Resources Canada.
And Natural Resources, why didn't you make this aware to the commissioner? Anyone?
Mr. Chair, the statistics of the counting of those trees was not available at the time of the audit period, and was only several months later that the number of trees planted was.
But why did you count the trees
to
outside the program?
The program was designed to account for tree planting that across government efforts, as long as those were incremental and that they could be sufficiently validated. And
Is that how you received the question?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is the time. Mr. Caputo, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
If Mr. Desjardins wants an answer to his question, he can get an answer, and then I'll go.
There you are, Mr. Do you want to restate it, Mr. Desjardins, just for clarity? Why don't
Sure,
you
yeah.
Restate it.
The question is, at what point did somebody ask the question other than the commissioner as to how many trees were planted, and why would you have? And is that the question that you were asked to why you included the trees from the other program, or why did you include those trees at all?
Mr. Chair, the program was designed to include trees across government programs as long as they met the two conditions that Ms. Frison has spoken about earlier. Those statistics were not available to us at the time of the audit period, but I'll invite colleagues to add to it if they wish.
Yeah, from our perspective,
I plan on directing my questions here to Mr. DeMarco. Thank you very much for your report, and I'm fairly new to this. Well, I am new to this committee. I don't normally sit here. Those who know me know I'm more of a justice person, to be candid. But I'm reading this as somebody who's not on this committee, and this, to me, looks like the beginning of an unmitigated disaster, if I could put it that way, in that the government has pledged to plant 2 billion trees, and we're nowhere near on track. Is that accurate?
They weren't on track as of the date of our report. They consider themselves to be on track now that they're counting trees from another program.
Okay, so if we cheat, we're on track. That's the government's position?
Well, I've said it before that we had said in our report they're unlikely to meet their target unless significant changes are made. I was not hoping for changes in accounting. I was actually hoping for changes in the number of agreements and the number of actual trees, incremental trees planted from the date of our report forward. And I should say that even if they didn't know the exact number, and we've heard about statistics from that other program, they should have alerted us saying, we intend to count tens of millions of more trees from another program. Even if they didn't know the exact number, we should have been told that these trees were sitting in this very large back pocket of theirs from another program.
So this is an F for execution and an F triple minus for transparency. Do I have that right?
Well, I'm not in the business of giving grades, but I am disappointed that we were not told about that. It's an important part of the audit process for us to be told about anything that could affect our findings, including this, which would affect not only Exhibit 1.3, but it affects Exhibit 1.4 and several of the paragraphs about costs as well, because we don't know if they're spending $3.2 billion on 2 billion trees, $3.2 billion on 2 billion trees, or some lesser amount of trees.
I'm utterly befuddled. This is a government that has missed virtually every single target when it comes to climate. And now we've got a chart here that talks about net megatons and us reaching it at 2031, but it's predicated on the government reaching its targets, which they haven't yet reached and are nowhere near reaching. They want to plant, by my count, about 5.5 times more trees that they couldn't plant in 2022. And all of our numbers are predicated, when I say our numbers, all of the government numbers are predicated on this. I mean, how do we not sit around this table as parliamentarians and not be disappointed?
Well, I share your disappointment about Canada's track record on climate change. There's no doubt about that.
I'm speechless. This is just, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 4 minutes, please.
4 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm not prepared.
No, it's on. It's on. It's on. Okay, just right there. Okay.
Okay. So what inconsistencies, and this is for Mr. DeMarco, have you found in the documents and analytical frameworks used by various government stakeholders in Canada? Which were the most relevant? Which ones should Environment and Climate Change Canada use as a guide?
So we're talking about forest carbon accounting, the second half of the report?
Yes.
So the inconsistencies are illustrated in Exhibit 1.8, where we have 3 lines on that graph showing that depending on the year of the report, 2019, 2020, or 2021, the calculation of forest carbon sink or forest carbon source varied for the same year, for the same variable. So we have significant inconsistencies there and a lack of transparency and utility for decision makers on the role of forestry and the role of forests in Canada's carbon accounting. So those areas do need to be tidied up. And I should say that Canada is one of the big 3 forested countries in the world. We need to get this right. This is a very large responsibility Canada has with this amount of forested land. We shouldn't be seeing year by year wild fluctuations as to whether the emissions in a given year were actually net negative or net positive. That needs to be clarified, and it has a huge impact on not only our emissions numbers, our net emissions numbers, but a huge impact on how we would manage the forest differently if we have better information.
Thank you. So for the Department of the Environment, recommendation 1.76 is about inconsistent progress reporting. What action does the department intend to take to improve the domestic reporting documents for estimating the contribution of forests to Canada's 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reduction target?
You want to take it? You go ahead.
Yes, the government is committed to annual reporting of projections and the progress towards targets. We work very closely with other departments, including NRCan, to develop the expected contributions, accounting contributions from the land sector, including forest. As my deputy minister said, the forest sector is very complicated, more complicated than other sectors. But we work closely with NRCan on the reference level approach. And as mentioned earlier, there's a review currently going on of the accounting practices, and we're looking to have that completed by the end of this calendar year.
So does the department intend to consistently include that forested land in the relevant greenhouse gas indicators for frameworks? And if so, which frameworks?
I'm not sure which frameworks, but for our annual reporting, we do include the contribution of the forestry to the LULUCF sector.
So I think this is back to M&R. Do you know any other countries that have a similar program to the $2 billion, $2 billion trees programs? Anyone else taking this sort of approach that you're aware of internationally?
We know that there are other countries that have committed to planting incremental trees. We can provide some information on that to the committee if you wish.
And the success of those particular programs?
I think all countries would find it challenging. as we do. It's a complex long-term program, and I don't think any of them are finished yet. I think they are all very recent. There aren't very many, though.
Thank you. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for questioning. I do want to thank all the witnesses for coming today. Mr. Vandergrift, I do want to thank you as well for joining us in from overseas. I'm not a great fan of Zoom and virtual, but I do appreciate you making time to join us in this circumstance. I always encourage witnesses who are in the National Capital Region to come in. You could not be in. I know it's late where you are, so I hope you have time for a dinner tonight before calling it in. There are many fine restaurants in London, as I'm sure you'll discover. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming in. I will excuse you now. I'm going to just suspend for about 30 seconds, just so you can clear it, and then I'll come right back to the committee work here. So just 30 seconds. To order. Mr. Nader, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very brief. Obviously, what we saw this week from the Auditor General was an appalling display of incompetence and potential corruption. What we've seen is an appalling lack of documentation, a lack of forthcoming, and I think we have to address this. I would note that today in question period, Minister Dominic LeBlanc said to the effect that we need to make sure that every document is available. So to that end, I would like to move a production motion, and it will be circulated to the committee in both official languages, that, given that the Auditor General was unable to properly audit subcontractors used by GC Strategies and other contractors in ArriveCan, and the Procurement Ombudsman found that 76% of contractors used in ArriveCan did no actual work, the committee A, order the Canada Border Services Agency, the Public Health Agency of Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and all other government departments and agencies involved in ArriveCan to provide a complete list of subcontractors that received work on ArriveCan, the service provided, and the total amount of money paid under the subcontracts within 7 days of this motion being adopted. B, order the main ArriveCan contractors, including GC Strategies, Dalian Enterprises Incorporated, Inc., Amazon Web Services, Inc., Microsoft Canada, Inc., Tech Systems, Inc., Donnacona, Inc., BDO Canada, LLP, MGIS, Inc., 49 Solutions, Makwa Resourcing, Inc. /TPG Technology Consulting Limited, and Advanced Chippewa Technologies, Inc. to provide a complete list of subcontractors that received work on ArriveCan, the service provided, and the amount of money paid under the subcontracts within 7 days of this motion being adopted. C, order the Auditor General to provide a complete list of the 21 other contractors that received a combined $6 million identified in Exhibit 1.1 of the ArriveCan app, the service provided, and the total amount of money paid under the contracts within 7 days of this motion being adopted. And D, orders GC Strategies and all relevant government departments, agencies, and Crown corporations to produce a complete list of subcontractors used, the service provided, and the total amount of money paid in relation to all contracts GC Strategies has received since 2015 within 7 days of this motion being adopted. And E, report this motion to the House for its information. I think it's pretty clear this is information that we as a committee need and that the Canadian public deserves answers to. Thank you, Chair.
I have a list. I've got Mr. Brock, Ms. Khalid, Mr. Genuis. Mr. Brock, you have the floor.
Point of order, Chair. I'm pretty sure I had my hand raised first. I'm more than happy to entertain Mr. Nader, but I'm just not understanding the question order list.
You're next, Ms. Khalid, so we'll get to you right away. Mr. Brock, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And a member who has been part of this particular scandal for the better part of 2 months. The need for transparency and accountability is ever more increasingly urgent. It was disturbing to hear the Auditor General, who's got decades worth of audit experience, proclaim to Canadians and to parliamentarians this particular scandal being one of the worst examples of poor record keeping, management keeping. A number of ministries had been involved in the creation of this disastrous app, and the runaway costs are disturbing on so many levels, but particularly to taxpayers. We have no idea as to the exact figure. We know it's well in excess now of $60 million. The exact figure is completely unknown because of missing documentation. Documentation that should have been available to the Auditor General. There should have been a budget. There wasn't. And the whole concept of ministerial oversight, particularly in relation to the minister responsible for public safety, the minister responsible for public health, the minister responsible for procurement, and the president of the Treasury Board need to accept responsibility, because under their collective watches, this app has been an absolute disaster. So I wholeheartedly endorse my colleague, Mr. Nader's production motion, because a lot of people need to account for what they did.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. I just see that the bells are ringing. Is there UC to continue to the bottom of the hour? This, before I adjourn the meeting, we will be meeting, notice will go out today, probably tomorrow. We're going to be meeting as a committee on Tuesday at 10 a.m. and Wednesday at 10 a.m. You'll have the, I'm telling you this as a courtesy so you can prepare your travel plans. You're welcome to join us by Zoom or to come back into the National Capital. Tuesday 10 a.m., Wednesday 10 a.m. You'll have the official notices tomorrow. Meeting adjourned.
Bye.